Twagholio here. I'm going to introduce the topic of the Fearhole Rick. This is a concept of a Rick who lives inside of the fear hole in relation to his master, resulting in a vast improvement of character development, mainly through this Rick's cooperation, to allow the fear hole to form his character like his own author. Fearhole Rick, who I call Second Rick, was actually an idea of a Rick at first to be an opposite of Rick Prime. When Evil Morty controlled Evil Rick, he introduced the scale of most evil Ricks to Rick C137. This OC was born in my mind at this scene specifically. Second Rick being called second out of humility that he is not number one, like Rick Prime would call himself Prime as the best Rick. Second Rick is invisibly an extremely honorable Rick that would surpass other Ricks in wisdom and maturity. Ricks would not be concerned of tracking this Rick, since this one, who is being as good as possible, would be seen as weak. He wouldn't be seen as a threat, and perhaps very strange. Second Rick has not touched portal travel, his lore being his family dying in a car crash prior to Rick Prime visiting. Rick Prime had no leverage over Second Rick. In fact, Second Rick was so fearful and cowardly that Rick Prime couldn't stand being around him, seeing a resemblance of himself through this Rick that was sickening to him. This was Second Rick's beginning to turn away from taking his own life. In fact, even asking Rick Prime to do so for him. He then seeked a new purpose after this. His new purpose being a selfless act of sacrifice, but not exactly sacrificing himself to himself, but through a being who is more wise than himself to take away his impurity and shift the gold out of his character. The fear hole can indeed achieve this. The fear hole becomes a shortcut to wisdom and character strength, surfacing his weaknesses and strengths at an acceleration due to how Second Rick is allowing himself to be malleable. The fear hole, like an author, refines him in a way like a goldsmith. Second Rick completely surrendered to this process. The fear hole is a forge that is open, but doesn't force anything. It is through Second Rick's eagerness to be refined, his willingness not to leave the fear hole, even if it's extremely hard. The fear hole is pouring treasure upon him from a world that is outside of his own, intervening with his low resolution reality within the multiverse of Rick and Morty. So, the philosophy I will go over briefly. I don't want to overwhelm the audience. That's why I wanted it simple. Tried to make the details not overwhelmed. That's why when I was doing this art piece, I took a lot of time to be careful not to add too much detail. So this is kind of like the mirror, but I made it a skull. And the harp is the stillness, as if like the stillness that he's trying to have in the midst of a storm, like as if the environment were to be very chaotic. He's going to be wanting to achieve this stillness. And then his reasoning. He needs to have reasoning to be able to look back at the reflection over and over. And in a way, the fear hole is like being indirect, yet is very direct doing all of this, is by providing tools rather than directly, like it's more of like his training ground in a way. So there we have it. All of this was a concept, not theory. I showed a bit of the process of making this art piece. I explained a bit of the lore and pointed out the philosophy And I will wrap it up here.